The next gospel to be written was Matthew, probably 10 or 20 years after Mark, around 80 or 90 CE.
Gospel of Matthew is attributed to Matthew, one of the 12 disciples, but it's improbable that this was actually written by an eyewitness, because Matthew's gospel is using as one of its major sources Mark. And if Mark is not written by a disciple even, why would a disciple, an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry, use somebody else's second-hand reports? Why wouldn't they just tell their own story?
And also Matthew, again, is writing in Greek.
Matthew is written, I think, by a Jewish Christian who, he kind of likes Mark's gospel. He copies whole passages verbatim, so he clearly quite likes Mark's gospel. But I think he thinks Mark got some things wrong.
For Mark, who's firmly in Paul's world of Christian Gentiles, Jesus doesn't appear to be very Jewish. Matthew, on the other hand, calls BS and all of that. In Matthew, Jesus is quite clear that he's only interested in the Jews.
I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Matthew 15:24-26. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. Matthew 10:5-6.
Which makes Paul's claims that the ghost of Jesus told him to go and preach to the Gentiles pretty suspect. I mean, if that was Jesus' original intention, you think he would have told his apostles.
So Matthew is engaged in this fascinating project of re-Judaizing Jesus. And quite interestingly, because Jesus was a Jew and because he was probably quite faithful to the law, Matthew, in a way, is also re-Jesusizing Mark's gospel. He's actually bringing it a bit back around to what Jesus was probably more like, the historical Jesus, that is.
A Jew.
Yeah.
Preaching to Jews about being a good Jew.
Right.
It is an irony of history that the most popular gospel in Christian history, far and away, has been the Gospel of Matthew. And yet it presents the most Jewish, of the four Gospels, and probably would have been quite hostile to the kind of law-free Christianity that Paul is proposing. These two sources, Paul and the Gospel of Matthew, would definitely come into conflict over whether Gentile Christians should follow the law. Paul definitely says, no, they don't. Matthew says, yes, absolutely, they do.
So Matthew's position is, if you're not going to temple, you're not circumcised, and you're not eating kosher food, you're doing Jesus wrong?
That's right. They have to get, well, at the very least, they have to get a copy of the Talmud and start learning Hebrew.
Wear a yarmulke.
Yeah.
The Matthew Gospel is where some of those most famous and dubious Jesus stories first turn up. Remember how in Paul's day there seemed to be lots of factions telling different stories about Jesus? Matthew seems to have included stories he had heard that Mark either hadn't heard or just didn't like. Stories like the Sermon on the Mount, the resurrection appearances, and the massacre of the innocents, where Herod the Great, king of Judea, orders the execution of all male babies around Bethlehem. Historians, by the way, have found no other evidence of that ever happening. Matthew probably just made it up to sound like the similar story about Moses in the Old Testament. Matthew is also the first person to mention the virgin birth.
So fully half a century appears before we ever get anyone writing about a virgin birth.
The story of the virgin birth, I think, is baffling. You have in Matthew's Gospel this genealogy that connects Jesus right back to Abraham, going through David.
King David, the possibly mythical second king of the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah, who supposedly killed a giant with a slingshot.
All going through Joseph, Jesus' father. Then the very next story is about how Joseph isn't Jesus' father. I mean, religious people are very good at getting their head around contradictions, but there's a big one right there on the very first page of the New Testament. It's fascinating. What did Matthew think he was doing? Why is he telling a story about a virginal conception when he also wants to tell us that Jesus was descended from David via his father?
Did he just hope no one would notice? And so Jesus is the descendant of King David because Joseph is his father? But I thought Mary was a virgin.
Yeah, look over there. It's the Messiah.
Where?
Oh, no, it's just Larry. They got the same beard.
Oh, no, I lost my place.
Hey, don't worry about it. Let's go get a kosher kebab.
And the fact is, lots of people don't notice. Many Christians will happily affirm Jesus is the son of David. They will also affirm that Jesus was conceived by a virgin.
Scholars believe that Matthew's idea of a virgin birth is possibly based on a bad translation of the Old Testament. See, in the Hebrew version of the prophet Isaiah, he predicts that a baby boy will be born as a sign that God is going to destroy his enemies. And the Hebrew word that Isaiah uses to describe the mother of the boy is Alma. Now, Alma just translates as a childless young woman, but Matthew wasn't using the Hebrew version of Isaiah. He was using a Greek translation, which mistranslated Alma into virgin. Another unfortunate thing about Matthew's Gospel is, despite it being fairly pro-Torah, it's also inspired 1900 years of anti-Semitism.
In Matthew's Gospel, you have this ideal of a kind of loyalty to Torah, loyalty to the synagogue, to all of these Jewish traditions, and yet also this bitter vitriol against fellow Jews.
Now keep in mind that although Matthew is a Jew, and he's writing for a community of Jewish Christians, they're an extremely fringe sect, kind of like the way that Catholics view Mormons today. And he's writing 10 or 20 years after this big Jewish-Roman war, so Jews are probably pretty unpopular across the empire. And the Jesus Jews want to distance themselves from the traditional Jews as much as possible for political reasons. And Matthew, just like Mark and Paul before him, believes that the end of the world is going to happen very soon.